wanted to do the timer
Oh, okay.
because David said that's what freaked him out the most.
Oh,
I'm not afraid of it.
he's not giving notices.
Austin.
Colin from so
Does anyone still know? I haven't gotten to back on it.
yeah.
No.
Why don't you sit here?
Just kills me. It's short. No, that's gonna be shorter.
Okay, I said David was coming. You'll probably sit like right there. And I just knew where it was.
You used to sit right here. Right? Yeah, that was your seat. Just against the rail.
Oh, I
Like 10 minutes.
yeah. I don't like never else.
Test, test. Yep.
Subcommittee will come to order. It's good to be back in the chair again, but my friend Ms. McCollum and I have switched roles yet again. This is a better view, actually. So, today the committee will receive testimony on the war in Ukraine. First, I would like to welcome our two witnesses, Celeste Wallander, who serves as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security and Affairs, and Lieutenant General Douglas Sims, the Director for Operations at the Joint Chiefs of Staff. We look forward to your testimony. 1 year ago, the democratic nation of Ukraine was invaded by Russian forces without provocation. Over the past year, Russia has carried out brutal attacks on Ukrainian forces as well as civilians, including women and children. First, I wish this never had come to this conflict. I think if it wasn't for our disastrous withdrawal in Afghanistan, if we'd provided a more robust deterrent to Ukraine earlier, Putin may have made a different decision, and we may have had a completely different situation, may have been able to avoid this conflict. Many predicted that Kyiv would fall in a matter of weeks, if not days. Instead, under President Zelensky's leadership, the Ukrainian people rallied to defend their country. If left unchecked, this ruthless Russian aggression would have surely expanded beyond Ukraine. Leaders in Moldova, the Baltic states, thought that they would have been next. Thankfully, the Western free world has stood beside Ukraine, supported the heroic efforts of the military. Their fight is a worthy fight by stopping the Russian march across Europe and degrading their military capability. Ukrainian forces are inflicting significant damage on one of the world's most evil regimes. The war has taken its toll on both sides, but at this point, Russia has lost strategically, operationally, and tactically. With the support of the United States and our allies, Ukraine has ended Putin's dream of reuniting the old Soviet Empire. This multinational response to the Russian aggression was no small feat, and it sends a message to President Xi and other authoritarian dictators that if they invade their neighbors, they will pay a heavy price. That said, like all peace-loving people, Americans want to see this conflict come to an end. The Russians must understand that the West is united behind the Ukraine, and Russia must end this senseless conflict. Until then, this committee will ensure Ukraine has both the defensive and offensive capabilities they need. The battlefield is dynamic, and Ukraine must have what it needs immediately. That is why this hearing is so important. First, the subcommittee needs to hear what Ukraine's critical needs are and how we can expedite delivery of equipment. Second, through oversight of the use of tax dollars is both the constitutional responsibility and one of my top priorities as chair of the subcommittee. This subcommittee will not be writing blank checks. In order to receive funding, there should be a plan and the details required to justify the need for funding. Any funding provided will be followed by rigorous oversight of the use of funds to ensure that they are used as Congress intended. American taxpayers deserve no less. Finally, we have all read rumors in the press, which, if true, would be extremely problematic. This includes weapons not reaching Ukrainian soldiers or that they are being sold on the black market. I would like the witnesses to take this opportunity to set the record straight and dispel any inaccurate reporting. Support for Ukraine is bipartisan, but it's not without limits and free from demands for transparency. This administration can and should do a much better job in showing the American people how funds are being spent. I look forward to ongoing conversations with the administration on this topic. With that, I would love to recognize the distinguished ranking member, recent chair, and my good friend, Ms. McCollum, for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd also like to welcome our witnesses. There's no question this has been quite a year. We have witnessed the horrific actions by the government of Russia, the heroic efforts of the Ukrainian people to defend their homes, the incredible efforts of the United States, NATO, EU partners to support Ukraine in their time of need, and some non-NATO allies who are looking, as Nordic nations, to become part of NATO. When this invasion began, no one thought Ukraine could withstand the overwhelming force that Russia threw against it. Yet they continue to stand strong. I want to strongly commend the Biden administration for their efforts and for the Congress's bipartisan support that we have provided. And I hope this support will continue to be provided to the people of Ukraine. Our actions are more than just providing ammunition, equipment, and bilaterals to support Ukraine. By taking a strong stand against Russian aggression in Ukraine now, we are saying loud and clear to Russia and to others, attacks on burgeoning democracies are unacceptable. This global perspective last week was also recognized. The UN resolution calling on Russia to leave Ukraine passed with 141 votes out of a total of 193 countries. Since taking office, the Biden administration has notified more than $33.5 billion in security assistance to Ukraine from a total of enacting funds of $62.9 billion. And that does not include the $26 billion in presidential drawdown authority under the preview of the president. As we continue to see this important impact that the weapons, equipment, and tools that the United States and our allies provide, we see Ukraine be successful in their counteroffensive, especially last fall. Given the sheer amount of equipment transfers, it would be helpful for the briefers to provide the committee with the methodology that the department is using to ensure the equipment is provided to the appropriate Ukrainian units for their mission. It would also be helpful for you to share what you believe has been the most vital piece of military equipment provided to the United States to the Ukrainians, and what you see as what will be vital going forward into 2023. Even with the support of the United States and our allies, Putin appears to be fully invested in tearing Ukraine apart. In his speech last week, it harkened back to the 21-year war by Peter the Great to win the Northern War, and that was not any event that we want to see repeated. Putin has decided to pardon prisoners by the thousands in exchange for military service. He has called upon hundreds of thousands of additional reservists. In light of Putin's continued escalation in Ukraine, I look forward to hearing from the briefers' perspectives on what military and diplomatic tools remain for the United States and our allies to use where we could impact Putin's calculus. I'd like to thank the chairman for holding this hearing and for the time to speak, and I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you for your remarks. I now recognize the distinguished ranking member of the Appropriations Committee, Ms. DeLauro, for her opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Chairman Calvert and Ranking Member McCollum, for hosting this important hearing. Thank you to our witnesses, Lieutenant General Douglas Sims and Assistant Secretary Celeste Wallander, for being here today. For the past year, Russia has waged an egregious, unprovoked war against the Ukrainian people. And during this time, we have become witness to one of the worst humanitarian crises the world has seen in generations. As we continue to watch in horror, civilians, including children, people in hospitals, expectant mothers, are being targeted by Russia's unprovoked and utterly inhumane attacks. As the President and Vice President have stated, Russia is committing crimes against humanity. Entire towns and cities have been devastated by the attacks. Thousands of hospitals and schools have been bombed. Children have been abducted and relocated to Russia. Tens of thousands of civilians and fighters have been killed and injured as a result of the conflict. And over 13 million people have had to flee their homes. Despite this unimaginable anguish and destruction, the resolve of the Ukrainian people is strong. Ukraine remains free and determined to repel Russian aggression. And with American and international support, Russia has failed in its objective of conquering Ukraine, and we have been successful in helping to defend global democracy. Over the past year, I was proud to lead this committee and the Congress in the passage of 4 supplemental bills, 2 appropriations packages that included over $62.9 billion in security assistance. At the same time, the United States has led allies and partners who have committed an additional $50 billion in security assistance to Ukraine. All of this funding has been instrumental in ensuring Ukraine's military strength, providing economic support, addressing the humanitarian toll of the war, and enforcing sanctions against Russia. I echo Ranking Member McCollum's remarks that we are gathered here today to learn more about how these resources have been used, what support has been the biggest impact, and what more can be done to continue this fight as Russia's tactics develop. The United States must continue to be a strong partner in the fight to protect global democracy, and I remain committed to ensuring Ukraine has the necessary resources to defend its independence. The safety and security of our world depend on it. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses and to continue to work closely with you. Thank you again, Chairman Calvert and Ranking Member McCollum, and I yield back.
Thank you. Assistant Secretary Wallander, your full written testimony will be placed in the record. In the interest of time, I encourage you to summarize your statement in 5 minutes or less. You are recognized.
Thank you. Chairman Calvert, Ranking Member McCollum, members of the committee, it's an honor to appear before you today alongside Lieutenant General Sims to express the unwavering support of the United States for Ukraine's sovereignty and security in the face of Russia's unprovoked and brutal invasion. Thank you for holding this important hearing at this pivotal time for the security of Ukraine, of Europe, and of the world. As Secretary Austin said at the Halifax Security Forum this past November, our support for Ukraine's self-defense is an investment in our own security and prosperity. Russia has failed to achieve its objectives in Ukraine. Its military is paying tremendous costs. Ukraine remains united and determined to expel Russia's invading forces from its territory. We are seeing intense fighting in eastern Ukraine as Russia seeks points to exploit, and Ukraine defends tenaciously. What happens in the coming months may prove decisive, and we are focused on providing Ukraine with the military capabilities it needs to defend its people and territory and prepare to advance in what we will expect will be an effective counteroffensive. We are doing this in close cooperation with our allies and partners. First, we have focused on a layered, integrated approach to air defense to counter Russia's devastating attacks on Ukraine's population centers and civilian infrastructure. The Patriot systems from the United States, Germany, and the Netherlands will give Ukraine advanced, long-range capability. These are complemented by medium and short-range air defense capabilities, such as NASAMS and Avengers, that we have provided. And just last week, Italy and France announced that they will also provide Ukraine with a SAMP-T system. Second, to enhance Ukraine's ability to maneuver, the United States will provide Abrams main battle tanks, the best tanks in the world. The UK has committed Challenger tanks, and other European states will provide Leopard tanks. These main battle tanks are complemented by other vital armor capabilities, such as Bradleys and Strykers from the United States, Swedish CV-90s, French AMX-10s, and German Martyrs. Third, we have expanded U.S.-led collective training to enable the Ukrainians to integrate fires and maneuver. Our training will complement the specialized training conducted by the United States, the European Union, and our allies. Finally, we continue to work with allies and partners to deliver a steady flow of artillery rounds and other ammunition so Ukraine can sustain its fight. Russia has discovered that the United States and our allies and partners are serious about supporting Ukraine for the long haul. Our assistance to Ukraine is possible thanks to bipartisan support from Congress. The Department of Defense appreciates the most recent Additional Supplemental Appropriations Act, which provides presidential drawdown authority, funding for the military services to replace items sent to Ukraine, and funding for the Ukraine Security Assistance Act, or USAI. Presidential drawdown allows us to get Ukraine critical capabilities quickly. USAI allows us to contract with industry for new and innovative solutions while building Ukraine's longer-term defense. We are also ramping up defense industrial-based production of critical munitions and equipment, doubling or tripling capacity in many cases. Allies have bolstered global production as well. France and Australia recently announced that they will increase 155 millimeter ammunition production to support Ukraine. And even as we focus on getting Ukraine what it needs, we have been ensuring accountability. We have adapted our accountability practices for the combat environment to address the risk of illicit diversion using mechanisms that go above and beyond our standard practices. The U.S. government has not seen credible evidence of any diversion of U.S.-provided weapons outside of Ukraine. Instead, we see Ukraine's frontline units effectively employing security assistance every day on the battlefield. A year ago, Russia launched its brutal invasion to destroy Ukraine as a free and sovereign nation, threatening European security and transatlantic unity. Today, NATO is stronger, Europe is investing in its own security at record rates, and the incredible people and armed forces of Ukraine remain unbowed and unbroken. This war has demonstrated that aggression is not worth the price paid by the aggressor. That is a lesson that should reverberate around the world, including among autocratic leaders everywhere. We are determined to support Ukraine's fight against tyranny and oppression, and in doing so to defend the United States' interests and values that are clearly at stake. Thank you for your support and for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Next, I recognize Lieutenant General Sims for his testimony. General, you're recognized.
Chairman Calvert, Ranking Member McCollum, distinguished members, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I appreciate today's opportunity to join Assistant Secretary Wallander and update you on the U.S. military efforts to help the Ukrainian people in their combined fight against the Russian invasion. Today marks the 369th day since Russian forces invaded and began their illegal and unprovoked large-scale invasion of Ukraine. As we meet today, the current situation between Ukraine and Russia is generally static, with both sides employing heavy amounts of artillery, resulting in minimal changes of territory, but significant numbers of casualties. In general, and as you've seen reported in open sources, the most active portion of the battlefield is around the town of Bakhmut. Over the past 2 months, the Russian army, with assistance from private military contractor Wagner Group, has fought savagely to defeat Ukraine's defenses, employing extreme amounts of artillery and waves of thousands of partially trained and mobilized soldiers and personnel contracted from prisons. The Russians have made incremental gains at great expense. Ultimately, the fighting has replicated the conditions the world last saw during the First World War. Key to changing this paradigm is creating a Ukrainian armed forces capable of breaking this state of fighting. In this regard, the concentration of U.S. effort has been focused on combining equipment and munitions with people in training. The intent and efforts of the U.S. military are designed to generate combat-credible forces capable of combining fire and movement to achieve maneuver and increase the overall capabilities of the Ukrainian armed forces. Importantly, this training effort is not solely the work of our U.S. armed forces, but a cohesive approach with our allies and partners. Collective training is ongoing throughout Europe and is dramatically increasing Ukrainian combined arms organizations. All told, since January, the U.S. military has trained another 1,000 Ukrainians, bringing the total trained by the United States to just over 4,000. As I speak, Ukrainians are training in multiple locations in Europe, working with U.S. service members and military trainers from our allies and partners. Key to our ability to conduct collaborative training has been the recent increase in maneuver-related equipment. The U.S. provision of Bradley fighting vehicles, Strykers, and Paladin howitzers, combined with similar fighting vehicles and tank contributions from our partners, is notably increasing the capability of the Ukrainian armed forces. In addition, the U.S. continues to supply critical munitions and individual equipment, from howitzer ammunition to medical and cold weather gear. Finally, and critically important to Ukraine's ability to continue to defeat Russian efforts to destroy civilian infrastructure, the United States will soon complete training and equipping of Ukraine's first Patriot battery. As you know, our air defense experts are providing key training at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. We are confident the Ukrainians will employ the Patriots with the same expertise they are demonstrating every day with their current air defense capabilities. Thank you for what this committee and this Congress have done and continue to do to provide oversight and resources in support of Ukraine as they continue the fight against the illegal and unprovoked large-scale invasion of Russia, or by Russia. While the Ukrainians bear the real burdens of this war, your support and that of the American people has had a profound effect on Ukraine's future. I thank you, and I look forward to today's questions and discussion.
Thank you, and we'll now begin our questions. Each member will have 5 minutes for their questions and answers. When your time returns yellow, you have 1 minute remaining. And first, I'll recognize myself. one comment beforehand. It was mentioned about the Abrams tanks coming to Ukraine. Maybe we can get an explanation in the near future on why we can't reconfigure existing Marine Corps tanks rather than acquiring new tanks. Apparently, the Secretary of the Army said if we're lucky, we could deliver the tanks in a year and a half. That seems somewhat of a significant delay. But the first question I have regarding the funding and monitoring that has been brought up. Since the Russian invasion a year ago, this committee has appropriated $45 billion in security assistance for Ukraine. The department has notified all but $4.5 billion in presidential drawdown authority and $7 billion in Ukraine security assistance initiative funding. Your obligations have lagged, however, with $35 billion remaining unobligated. Assistant Secretary Wallander, how long will your remaining funds last? Do you expect to submit another supplemental request before the end of the year, of fiscal year 23? And what measures does the department have in place to ensure accurate and use of monitoring of assistance that's being provided? Do you see any gaps in your capability and what you're doing to close those gaps?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On how long we expect the funds which you noted to remain enough to provide capabilities to the Ukrainians. At this point, we believe that those funds are sufficient for current plans. However, we will continuously reassess the levels of requirements. Many of them are driven by week to week on the battlefield conditions. But currently, we are looking at spending those allocated funds in order to provide Ukraine with the capabilities that they require through this fiscal year, although we will consider whether we would come to you and ask for additional funds. On the issue of the Abrams tanks, the Army currently does not have Abrams tanks available for redeploying or rediverting to Ukraine, and the Department of the Army is working in a very focused fashion to work on getting those potential delivery times of those tanks that would be available to shorten that time frame. But we don't have a revision to the timeline that you cited. On accountability, we've now delivered 2 reports to Congress on our procedures and processes for accountability. They extend in country now that we have a fully functioning Defense Attaché's office and Office of Defense Cooperation in Kyiv. We have provided capabilities to the Ukrainians to be able to electronically account for provision of capabilities, and the Ukrainians have been systematically and very appropriately providing with accounting for the movement of capabilities once they're in the country.
Thank you. I'll now recognize the ranking member, Ms. McCollum.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So as has been pointed out in the opening statements and in your statements, the United States has provided considerable assistance to the government of Ukraine, financial, humanitarian, and military, from ammunition to heavy vehicles to air defense systems. And they're using this to fend off the Russian attacks. And I would just, for the record, like to give a few examples. To date, we've provided 1,600 Stingers, 8,500 Javelins, and 298 tactical vehicles to tow weapons. And these items are making their way to the battlefield on a steady basis. And this support is provided through the Security Assistance Group. Ukraine handles weapons, shipments, personnel training, and other related tasks. This is a joint service command, and it will be manned by personnel from across the military services. This group will be responsible for ensuring that military equipment provided to Ukraine does not fall into Russian hands or get diverted from its primary purposes. As the chair asked you a question, could you maybe elaborate in a little more detail with the committee the activities of the Security Assistance Group Ukraine, or SAGU, I guess it's going to be referred to. I always like to say what it is before I go to the alphabet. Could you maybe talk about how that is to support U.S. efforts? And you mentioned electronic, just for this committee, because we're getting asked a lot of questions, just not to go too in the weeds or too granular, but a little more detail in how this accounting is taking place.
Thank you. On the accounting, it combines old-fashioned lists of capabilities and equipments that are handed over to Ukrainians from the security assistance hubs to a updated approach to reading, without getting into too much detail, reading indicators that are connected to specific pieces of equipment that are handed over and accounting for them in that manner. So it is both old-fashioned and technologically enabled, and the United States military liaisons work closely with Ukrainian armed forces in accounting for the handing over the equipment and the use of that equipment. The Ukrainian armed forces decide where they are going to then send specific equipments. That's not a decision of the U.S. military or other European countries. So that is coordinated, but ultimately decided by Ukrainian forces themselves. On SAGU, I'm going to turn over to Lieutenant General Sims for an explanation.
So, ma'am, let me talk one comment on in-use monitoring real quick. There's a real important distinction here with in-use monitoring, and ultimately, as you've heard folks talk about trust but verify, we are working towards towards reasonable assurance with our Ukrainian partners. I would tell you, first of all, there have not been, we aren't receiving reports of things that are making their way to other places to start with. But number two, the criticality of this being an existential thing for Ukraine. They would prefer to use a Stinger, a Javelin, as opposed to give it to someone else. That would be, one comment on that. On the SAGU, the Security Assistance Group Ukraine. So you'll recall last year in the April-ish time frame, before that, 18th Airborne Corps arrived in Europe. And that three-star command in the March-April time frame took over the effort in terms of the advise, assist, enable with equipment and other ways, intelligence being one of those. That relationship beginning last spring. Over the course of the year, that 18th Airborne Corps, that three-star headquarters, has continued to grow in terms of its capability, its effectiveness, and efficiency. It now is still a three-star headquarters. It is solely focused on the training, equipping, advising of our Ukrainian partners, and they're doing so across what we would call warfighting functions. So sustainment or logistics being one of those, in addition to intelligence or advice on maneuver. And so in that regard, sustainment-wise, it's become a huge connection to the Ukrainians in terms of not just providing them with equipment, but then providing them with the expertise in terms of how to maintain that equipment. Some of those are virtual connections. So, and I know many of the members have likely been forward in Yasanka, Poland, but in Yasanka, they have essentially a headquarters there where they are working in ways using, in a classified session, I'd tell you a different way, but they're essentially communicating directly with the Ukrainians who are using that equipment on the ground. Those individuals are able to reach back and get immediate assistance from the SAGU and from our partners who are linked into the SAGU. They did a terrible job of explaining that, but yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for convening this hearing on a matter of utmost importance in the world. Dr. Wallander, General Sims, thank you both for coming before the committee, sharing your insights. Indeed, what Ukraine has done in the defense of their homeland is admirable, beyond description, a cause we must continue to support. We've seen the Ukrainians fight far beyond expectations, in part due to the assistance we've provided to them. As you both stated, it's vital we continue our investment in Ukraine, as not only do their efforts weaken our global foe of Russia, but also aid in deterring other nations from attempting similar maligned incursions, such as China. One aspect of this conflict that is of particular interest of mine is increased use of unmanned systems to inflict damage. We've seen some sheer ingenuity out of our partners in Ukraine. Certainly, this marks a new chapter in how we plan for future conflicts through both direct involvement and military aid. As this conflict has evolved, how have emerging technologies changed our priorities of aid? Have there been any particular lessons that we've learned along the way? Doctor?
Thank you, Congressman. I fully agree with you in your characterization of the evolving nature of the battle, and also the required technology and the innovation of the Ukrainians. We have also innovated in what we've provided. Beginning early in the conflict, we focused on providing Stingers and Javelins, and last summer we began to shift to providing UAV capabilities and counter-UAV capabilities, exactly because we were seeing on the battlefield the kinds of developments that you've pointed to. At the same time, the Russians were suffering limitations in their own UAV capabilities. And unfortunately, Russians innovate too. And one of the things that they've innovated in is they've grown closer in relations with Iran and are relying on Iranian UAVs and one-way attack drones. We have distributed around for all of you to see evidence of course, Iran and Russia deny this, but actual evidence of how Iran's provision of advanced UAV capabilities, both ISR and attack UAV capabilities, have been enabling the constraints on Russian defense industry. But at the same time, we are ahead of that curve, and we are providing Ukraine with newer and more advanced counter-UAV capabilities as well. And the Ukrainians have been extraordinarily smart about adapting to that requirement as Russia uses those UAVs to attack critical infrastructure and civilian locations.
Joe Sims?
Sir, I think one thing that really strikes me, so my initial description, I kind of mentioned in Bakhmut as an example, where we see this First World War kind of revisited. That's a place in which both sides have not employed what we would call combined arms warfare. So we're talking about unmanned systems, everything from cyber, space, electronic warfare. We are learning lessons every day by the way that the Russians are conducting operations, the way that the Ukrainians are conducting operations. We're able to assist the Ukrainians in a number of areas, as you would expect. But we are, quite honestly, learning from them, I think, as much as anybody else, on the criticality of this combined arms effect and using all the domains of warfare. Things that don't cost very much money, in some cases, are proving very effective on the battlefield. You know, these small handheld drones is an example, and I know everybody on the committee has probably seen video of them, you know, these drone platoons that the Ukrainians are employing have turned that small, tiny drone into an extraordinarily effective weapon because of what it's tied back to in terms of its ability to reach back to an archer. And so I think we're learning a number of lessons about things that may not cost a lot that may prove very effective on the next battlefield.
Thank you both. Godspeed. You.
Thank the gentleman, Mr. Lauro.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I have two questions, Dr. Wallander, for you first, and then one to both you and Mr. Sims. Dr. Wallander, you said in your testimony at the close that, very important statement, our ability to provide Ukraine's forces with the capabilities they need rests on continued bipartisan support for this mission in the Congress. And I would add that it rests on continued bipartisan support through this committee. We have heard in some quarters that members have suggested that it may be time to end sending U.S. aid to Ukraine. So just on this point, how devastating would it be for Ukrainian forces if the U.S. Did cut back on aid or cut it off? How quickly would Russian forces overtake the Ukrainian military if we did cut off aid? Can you estimate the time $9 billion that we appropriated in security assistance will take to use? How quickly is more funding necessary to provide the Ukrainian military with the defense capabilities that they need to outlast the Russian forces? Second question to both of you. In recent weeks, President Zelensky has pleaded with the U.S. lawmakers and President Biden for additional funding and specific resources. It's a question for the two of you. With respect to administering the funding provided in 2022 and 2023, which sorts of munitions are being prioritized? How quickly are they being deployed? Is there anything that we can do to speed up deployment of such munitions? Is there to be, if there is to be an additional Ukraine supplemental, what other munitions would you prioritize getting to Ukraine first? Dr. Wallen?
Thank you, Congresswoman. I think the most important thing to understand is that President Putin, in the face of reality, has not changed his strategic objectives in this war. And his strategic objectives is to subjugate Ukraine. A sensible leader would have looked at the failures of his military, at the pain to his economy, and changed his war aims. We're not seeing that. So even if this summer results in a Ukrainian successful counteroffensive, even if there is a period of stalemate and rebuilding, Russia will, the best prediction is Russia will use that period of rebuilding to get ready to reattack. Mm-hmm. So in addition to the current flow of capabilities for the hot war that we're seeing right now, we need to be thinking about providing Ukraine with a modern defense capability that will be an effective deterrent, that will be too great of a challenge for the Russian military to misperceive the next time. And so there's the near term, which has been generously supported by the American people with the supplemental that we have. And as I indicated, we feel confident that that will see us through this current battle. But there will be a requirement to think longer term as well, a modernization, and not just the United States. We are working with European allies and partners, and actually globally with countries, to think about that. So I know that's probably not the answer everyone wants to hear. We'd like to think that the Russian leadership would wake up and go home and leave Ukraine alone, but the indications are quite the opposite. With that, let me turn to General Sims, because I think he can better answer the rest of your question.
Okay.
Ma'am, thanks for the question. Before I kind of talk to how we might go forward, I would call attention, and I was in the House Armed Services Committee earlier, and I made a similar comment that, you know, the criticality of this fight is, I mean, we are literally, 78 years into this international rules-based order that, if we allow to fall in this case, will have significant consequences for the world, I mean, from here on. Mm-hmm. And I'm not, people will bring up China. I'm not just talking about China. I'm talking about the world. It should be understood, here we are 78 years after a pretty horrific world war, that we created a system in which we don't tolerate the invasion of another country in this situation. And so I think you're right to call attention to the bipartisan support. I would tell you, I think it's not just an American view. I think it's a world view. We are certainly seeing in NATO, as an example, the strength of that alliance is stronger now than it ever was. And I have a lot of time in Europe. It's never been like it is now. And that's largely because I think we all recognize that this is important work, and it's going to have large, long-term impacts. On where we think we might go from here, I think what we're trying to do is work hard with our Ukrainian counterparts to make sure that we're providing them the key kit and equipment and munitions that are relevant to the fight that they're in. And right now, that's air defense, artillery, and maneuver systems, fighting vehicles that will, we believe, combined with really effective training, be able to turn the tide for the Ukrainians.
Thank you. At some point, I would love to confer with specific kinds of munitions that you think we might move forward, and if you think we will need another supplemental.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you. Mr. Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank both of our witnesses. Just quickly, actually, Fort Sill is in my district. I had the opportunity 2 weeks ago to visit with the Ukrainian forces that are there training. It's a pretty awesome sight. As one of my briefers told me before I went out to meet with them, he said, you have to remember, Congressman, these are people that have come immediately from combat, that are training and are going back to their own home to be in combat again. You're not going to talk to anybody that hasn't lost a fellow soldier, that hasn't lost a friend, that hasn't lost a family member. Talk with one individual who had lost both his parents and his wife
in the last 11 months due to Russian military activity. So they train with a purpose and ahead of schedule, and they're pretty awesome folks to meet. So I have no doubt about their resolve and intensity, and no doubt about the quality of the sport. So I have two questions. One is a very parochial one. Again, we're very proud to host the mission. We think the United States Army is doing an outstanding job in training, and we're curious if there will be follow-on Paladin training missions there. So far, we only know of this particular one. The second is probably a very unfair question, but it's not meant to be, and if you want to dodge around it, that's all right. But I am totally agree with the idea that this is a fight you have to win. I don't have any equivocation about that. I think the consequences of losing here for the country and everything that both of you have stated in terms of the international order are horrific. What I do wonder about is how do we define winning? Is this expelling the Russians from what they've taken? Is this restoring Ukraine circa 2014 before Crimea? Is this envisioning the end of the Putin regime, which I guess is really his choice more than it is ours in some ways? But, you know, or do we end up someplace like we did in Korea? This lasts for a long time, has a lot of casualties, and you end up with sort of an armed peace in place, an armistice as opposed to a settlement, and a significant long-term military commitment by both sides in terms of just protecting that frontier. So those are my two questions for now.
Sure, I'll start with the first one in terms of training in the United States. And first of all, sir, so 3 days ago we commemorated the year since the invasion. Today marks my year. I deployed to with my division headquarters last year. This time to Central Europe as a response to this. And while I was there, I had the chance to go to, as the training was nascent, to go and spend some time with the Ukrainians as they were training on some of our systems at the beginning. And I had the exact same experience. As an example, we were training the M113. And on the very first day of training, the intent was for them to get a familiarization of the 113. We'd kind of walk them around. Maybe we'd get on the course to drive it. So I arrived 2 hours after they've started, and the first vehicle is in pieces. And I said, guys, what's going on? And they said, we got here, and the Ukrainians were like, hey, this is great. How do you take it apart? And they had already taken the engine apart, and we're getting ready to put it back together. And as you mentioned, every one of them has a connection, a very personal connection to this, and they take it very seriously. I think we are examining every training site on a case-by-case. In this case, because of the expertise at Fort Sill, it made sense for us to bring the Ukrainians back to Fort Sill to execute. Up to now, and with the systems we have now, we have that ability in Europe, and so it's actually helpful to the Ukrainians because they don't have to go all the way back to the United States. But we do case-by-case, sir.
Okay, very good.
On your very good question about defining winning, I don't think that's an unfair question. It's an important question. It's a hard question to answer, in part because it will depend on how the summer's fighting plays out. It will depend on how we are able to keep the international community tight and close on sanctions and on defense industrial restrictions, which are really cutting Russia's capabilities. Not enough, because they have this option of Iran, hopefully not China. So there are a lot of variables. But what I will say is our position is that this has to end in a strategic failure for Russia, that no aggressor looking at this across the world thinks, oh, that's a good idea. I'm going to get what I want and not pay any price. And second, we have to support Ukraine. We need to have a sense of what we think is a good outcome, but we owe it to ourselves and we owe it to the Ukrainians to support their definition of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and security, and work with them if there comes a moment when the Russian leadership is ready to negotiate, that it is a Ukrainian-led process, because they've earned it.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I want to just get a sense of the midterm and the long term. If this already this has gone on for a year, so what's your sense of how Congress should prioritize funding over the long haul to address some of the long-term capability gaps that exist still for the Ukrainians?
Well, I'll give the bigger picture, but I'll leave it to General Sims to talk about specific capabilities. But the balance, one of the most valuable things, in addition to your consistent and constant support, has been being willing to provide support both under PDA and USAI. Because PDA has allowed us to pull from existing stocks for immediate battlefield needs, while USAI has allowed us to plan over, depending on the procurement timelines, for months or even years. So that balance of immediate capabilities and longer-term planning has been important from the start, but it becomes even more important as we think about assessing at the end of the summer where the battlefield stands, what it looks like, because we'll need to be thinking about those longer-term investments in a modern Ukrainian military. But I'll turn it over to General Sims to give you more on what that would look like.
So there's, and I hate to use this cop-out, but there is a bunch of stuff we could talk about in a classified setting, I think, that would give you a better view for where we think the future might go. I would tell you, as I mentioned earlier, the key to us right now is air defense. In particular with artillery and maneuver vehicles. The air defense piece is important. If you, back to the Bakhmut piece, because both sides have created air defenses in which they're unable to really employ their air, that limits that dimension of the fight. And so it's created the system or the process that they have right now. So air defense is going to be hugely important as we go forward.
I think the other thing I wanted to ask about, and this gets at the chairman's opening remarks, the nature of what we're providing has changed over time. I'm just curious what the evolution of end-use monitoring, how that has changed as the type of equipment we're providing has changed.
The evolution has been more in the realm of the fact that we have access now, because when the embassy was closed, we didn't have Americans in country. We didn't have a defense attaché's office. We didn't have an ODC. So now we have professionals who can work directly with the Ukrainian armed forces on the end-use monitoring. And then it was further enabled, in addition to sort of, like I suggested, old-fashioned checklists, where we started out at just like with all the provision of the capabilities, now to a more distributed capability enabled by technology. So I think it was less about the mix of capabilities and more about our access and our ability to train the Ukrainians how to do logistics, how to do accounting for the capabilities that we've provided, and their ability to step up and provide that information.
Thank you. Mr. Carter. Oh, yes, yeah.
Oh, thank you. Supposing we're getting UK tanks, Challengers, T-72 refurbished tanks from the U.S., Netherlands, Czech Republic, Leopard tanks from Germany, Poland, Canada, Portugal, Spain, Norway, Denmark, and the Netherlands, and Abrams tanks. I don't know a lot about this, but I know those tanks are all lighter than the Abrams tank. Because I was over in Holland and visited one of our depots over there, and they were explaining to me that the European soil was really too soft for the Abrams tank. So they had to take a lot of armor off the bottom of it so it wouldn't bog down. Now we're in the frozen time right now, and the Abrams not there yet. That's the way I understand it. Probably won't be there for a while. But if they get off, is the Abrams is it available to fight in that domain? And all these other tanks, what about air support? Because tanks are most vulnerable from the sky. And right now, we're not offering air support. Is anybody else offering air support? And we are, by the way, retiring 40 A-10s this year. And I don't know whether A-10 is capable of protecting tanks without a cover above them or not? I don't know that answer, so I'm asking you.
So let me talk tanks for a second. The M1 Abrams was designed with the thought that, and this is Cold War time, that we potentially fight on the European plains, essentially, fold a gap, if you will. That tank was designed to fight and win in Europe. It's fight and won in a couple other places, but that was designed for Europe. It is a heavier tank. And certainly that will be something of concern depending on what the environmental conditions are. Part of the timing of fighting in Ukraine, as you would guess, sir, is largely based on the environmental conditions. And so as the terrain is frozen, it offers opportunities for mobility. There's a period, in fact, it's beginning now, where it goes into significant mud, and you'll recall the pictures last year of Soviet or Russian tanks that were buried down to hull depth. We believe that they'll be able to employ Abrams tanks, Leopards as well, with pretty good efficiency in that terrain. And again, it's based on the environmental conditions. In terms of air support, sir, I'm a huge fan of the A-10. As an infantryman, I like the A-10. That was always something I like to hear buzzing above me. I would tell you that, and this goes to really any airplane right now that the Ukrainians would be able to employ. And the Ukrainians, as you know, have an air force of their own. The thing that's most formidable to the Ukrainians now are the Russian air defenses. And so they have executed some close air support missions with their assets. To do so, they really have to prepare the battlefield a great deal with a number of different systems. It wouldn't be any different with A-10s or with F-16s. Until the conditions are set in that regard against the air defenses, those are very difficult. They're really just difficult systems to use. There are a bunch of other reasons, a bunch financial, that I'll pass over to Ms. Wallander.
There was a question about how we decide what to provide the Ukrainians. Very simply, what we start with is their priority list of what their requirements are. Second step is SAGU, UCOM validate that priority list. And we prioritize the money you appropriated and authorized for us to spend based on that 2 tiers, taking into account readiness impacts on the United States. And so while, there's a talk of F-16s being desirable, everything is desirable, the Ukrainians have prioritized that air defense capabilities, Patriots, NASAMS, SAMP-Ts, Hawks, those air defense capabilities for the reasons that, as I understand it, General Sims laid out, and the armor to be able to conduct this offensive, and the artillery so that they can keep fighting the Russians every day.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Case.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Some funding and budget-related questions, since this is appropriations. First of all, just I think it's a simple question. Are we expecting that further funding requests will come through on supplemental appropriation requests, or is anything now being built into the FY 2024 base budget related to Ukraine, or do you know yet?
I know that there's work ongoing to build it into a base budget, yes. And we are not ruling out coming back to you and requesting a supplemental, but I don't have a specific plan or a figure for you at this time.
Do you know yet whether the range of requests related to FY 2024 would be roughly comparable to what we have already committed, the $113 billion roughly? Because now that's obviously, there's a lot of uncertainty in the answer to that question, but we've been through a pretty intense war for 1 year now. At $113 billion. Now that's not just defense related, it's humanitarian, it's other assistance. But I guess what I'm trying to get a sense of is, well, how much bigger would the bill be? I assume it would be bigger because we are moving up kind of the scale of intensity of weapons, but not just intensity, but expense also, I think. And so I would expect at least that we would, as we continue, if we continue for another year, I hope we don't, but we have to at least anticipate that possibility that we would see a higher bill for the next year. Do you have a sense of that? Have you calculated a range? Have you started to think in those terms inside of DOD?
Congressman, no, I don't have a sense of whether it would be higher continuity or reduced. I just know that we are planning for the kind of, like I said, effective deterrent force that Ukraine will need to be able to present too difficult of a task for the Russians.
Okay, fair enough. But I guess maybe it's a rhetorical question because, I mean, certainly I think from budgeting for this all, you would want to have some pretty reasonable ranges as we go through so that we can be realistic and not just, have to go to a supplemental every 3 months or 6 months or something like that. And related to that, information at least that CRS has put out indicates that collective contribution from the rest of the world to our $113 billion is somewhere around $85 billion. Obviously that is not $113 billion, so we're carrying the cost of this. But are there, to your knowledge, of discussions, and that $85 billion, the EU countries, somewhere around $55 billion. These are also not nonprofits, but NGOs like NGO is not even the right term for it, but World Bank, IMF, and then UK, $7 billion. But still, that seems to be low as a measure of collective GDP. And so are there ongoing discussions as to the increase in funding that is allocated by other countries to this effort as well?
Congressman, I would need to refer you to Treasury and to state on the broader funding for Ukraine that you refer to, humanitarian, economic reconstruction. On the DoD side, on the defense side, our numbers show that the United States has provided just over $30 billion in assistance, and European countries, members of the UDCG, have provided about $19 billion. So it comports about with your numbers. I will say that the United States is only 8th in the world in percentage of GDP in providing security assistance to Ukraine. Top of the list are Estonia and Latvia, who've each provided 1% of their GDP.
And I recognize that, and that's to be valued, but there are other countries that are full partners in this that have much lower contributions of defense to GDP. Some real allies of ours.
We work on that every month at the UDCG
cool.
meetings. Sir.
General, I'm really happy you talked about China because, to Mr. Cole's parochial, my parochial is the Indo-Pacific, being from Hawaii. Same basic question, are you building into the base budget, the FY 2024 base budget, any adjustments that relate to lessons learned from Ukraine, that relate to adjustments in our basic defense strategy with respect to countries such as China? What lessons are being taken and how are they being translated into a funding perspective?
So, sir, the first thing I would tell you is we are absolutely learning lessons from Ukraine that are driving our conversation about China. The expertise you're looking for on the Joint Staff on our budgeting is sadly not in this chair. But I am happy to circle back with you with an answer to your question. But I would tell you, as an example, 3 weeks ago I was in London at a I'll say lessons learned conference. That's a broad statement, but a lessons learned conference on where we are right now in Russia, Ukraine. And I was 30 minutes into the first session when I realized I'd brought the wrong people with me. The people that I should have brought from my shop were people that were focused on China, not people that were focused on Russia, Ukraine. And so in that regard, the department is looking very hard at the lessons we learned from this fight to inform future decisions.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. On the issue that Mr. Case brings up on our allies, I think a lot of people are concerned of it, especially Germany has not seemed to step up to the plate as much as they should, I would think, especially since they're right there in the neighborhood. With that, because Mr. Womack was in the chair, I'm going to recognize him first.
Thank you,
next.
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah.
Thanks to the witnesses here today. General, quick question for you. A year ago today, the war was in, I don't know what day it was, but it was like day 4, day 5. And I guess if you were Vladimir Putin, you thought it was probably about to end, just based on the basic load that Russian soldiers took into the territory and the operational guidance that they had. And I would guess that most everybody in this room probably thought that might be closer to accurate than otherwise. And then here we are, an entire year later, and doggone it, this thing is still raging and good for the Ukrainians. Did that surprise you?
So I think it surprised everybody, quite honestly. I think it surprised everybody. I think and not just talking in an intelligence picture, from the intelligence perspective. You know, if you surround a good portion of a country with 100,000 plus people, and there were a lot of assumptions, I think, about the Russian military before this. I mean, I would tell you, as someone who has spent some time studying them, I think we assumed that when the fight began that every individual would have a UAV over the top of them. It would be tied back to lethal fires that the Russians would deliver quickly and effectively. And you know, it was going to be a tough slog for the Ukrainians. I think there are a number of factors that went into getting us to where we are today. One of them, and the number one, is the Ukrainian people, certainly. And you know, the leadership in Ukraine has been steadfast. I think also the leadership in the Western, you know, in the West has been steadfast. Not to sound like a sycophant, but the work of this committee, this Congress, has had a huge effect on where the Ukrainians are today. And the advice that we have been able, with our partners, to provide has led to where we are today. There are miles to go before we sleep, sir. We have plenty of work to do, but I would tell you that there are men and women in all, not just in this uniform, and not just in Ukrainian, but others back to skin in the game, who are convinced that we're going to see this through.
You know, I spent 30 years in uniform, and I'm embarrassed to tell you that I was one of those guys that trained all my young military life to fight in the Fulda Gap against all those Russian assets. And let me add, before the Abrams tank, and that's really dating me. But when I see the pictures on television of all of these burned out tanks, Russian tanks, that were lined up on that stretch of highway, the first thought occurred to me was, man, don't you know an A-10 pilot would have just really loved that environment.
Yes, sir.
The second thought that occurred to me was, there's a whole lot of Russian technology sitting there on the side of the road, and have we done a pretty good job of being able to capture, and was it worth it, you know, to be able to capture the technology and what the Russian soldiers were fighting with in today's fight? Have we been able to capitalize on the technology that's been captured in this fight?
Sure, probably better for a different forum, and I'm happy to bring a team over to talk to you about that. The short answer would be, I think that we as a military are better off today than we were a year ago in all sorts of ways, and we're learning lessons from this fight that will serve us well. I quite honestly, I've said this out loud a couple times. Last year, when the Ukrainians were fighting in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, it's along a river. It was in the news for a long time. It's very similar to the way that this Bakhmut piece is fought, where they were fighting for every inch but they were in a retrograde and they were backing up. And I mentioned that I think we will, in our academies, at our schools, I think we will study a bunch of Ukrainian tactics implemented over the course of this last year. It's taught the world a lot of lessons, certainly will teach us some.
Last question. Everybody here, my colleagues know I'm a big fan of the state partnership program, and we've been helping in California, a state partnership program with Ukraine. This may be a question for you, Madam Secretary. Do we need a state partnership program like this in Taiwan? You know, as we look at the gains that happen as a result of these relationships.
Congressman, I share your admiration for state partnership programs. I will take that question back to my colleagues who are responsible for working with Taiwan. It's a great idea. I don't know if it has been considered, but clearly the Ukrainian armed forces really did benefit, and we benefited. We got to know them really well because of the great work that the California National Guard did with Ukraine all those years.
Thank you. You go back.
Thank you for recognizing California. Mr. Garcia. Mr. Aguilar, excuse me. I had Garcia on the line. Next question. Excuse me.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and appreciate my colleague from Arkansas noting the partnership in California. So I'll skip that question, and obviously thankful to the Ukrainian people for the fight, the Ukrainian Security Assistance Initiative, and the PDA, obviously, for the sustained and unwavering support and the leadership that the President Zelensky and President Biden have worked with the international community in order to further assistance deliveries. My question is about drawdowns and depleted stocks, and I'd like both of you to ask about this, to answer what actions are we taking to replenish these stocks. Assistant Secretary, you talked about some munitions in your testimony, but what's given the drawdown authority transfers, where are we looking at? What are the concerns that we have in the near term with respect to the industrial base and the challenges that we have ahead, given the drawdowns?
Thank you, Congressman. So let me highlight that first, before we even have to worry about replenishing, any decision about providing a capability to Ukraine looks first, after the assessment of what's required, at what the implications for providing that capability from our stocks would be on our readiness. And there is a process of assessing whether a drawdown in a particular capability, whether that's ammunition, artillery, counter-UAS, radars, all across the capabilities, whether the reduction would implicate in a negative way any readiness concerns. And the services, all the services play a role in every decision. So that is baked into our decisions about what to procure or draw down for the Ukrainians. Secondly, your funding for PDA includes replenishment. So that is built in as part of the process. As soon as there's a decision to draw down from existing stocks, to begin the process of working on replenishment. So it is it's not a sequential, it's parallel process. And the third is, again, in large measure because of Congress's provision of more flexibility in procurement, we've been able, my colleagues in acquisition and sustainment have been able to work with industry to look at how to ramp up production capacity and timelines, and part of that has been being able to procure over multiple years so that companies were seeing the effects of them being willing to invest in supply chains. So for example, 155 millimeter production, which was at about 14,000 a month, is now already up to 15,000 a month, which I know doesn't sound too exciting, but by the end of the year, it should be up over 20,000 a month because of the investments that have been made. With a few years down the road, the goal is 85,000 a month. So it really does make a difference that we have that timing horizon so that we can work with industry and they know that their investments will pay off with longer term acquisition.
General.
Sir, when first time I went to the Pentagon, the North Koreans were shooting missile after missile, and there was this view that, you know, something might happen on the peninsula. This is, I don't know, 6 years ago. And I was on the Army staff working for General Milley as the chief at the time, and the book that was essentially mandatory reading was a book called, I think it was Freedom's Forge. And essentially what it did was talk about the fact that our success in World War II was not because we started when we did, but because we started years before that. And, you know, people like Kaiser working concrete and, you know, getting into shipbuilding from how we were doing our, aircraft and tanks with assembly lines. I mentioned earlier that I think we in the military have learned a lot of lessons that will be beneficial to us in the future. I'd like to think that as a country we're learning many of the same lessons. So as it relates to the defense industrial base, and this is this is not my bailiwick, but as it relates to the defense industrial base, that some of the things we're seeing now will prepare us in the future should, and I don't think we're going to get there, sir, but should they be necessary, we have those types of equipment and ammunition available to us. I'm not sure we would have seen that had we not been trying to help Ukraine the way we are now.
General, what can you tell me about the maintenance and sustainment of the Ukrainian forces in the kind of 2 to 5 year window, especially when it comes to, industrial base and drawdowns?
Crazy wild. I mean, so it's...
Is that an official military?
Probably not. Sir, this is crazy. If you told me I was going to command a battalion, and in that battalion I would have Bradley fighting vehicles, I would have Swedish CV-90s, I'd have artillery systems from Italy, I would tell you, my first question would be, how am I going to sustain that? And so we asked that same question. In fact, Secretary Austin and the chairman are very concerned with the ability to sustain the force that the Ukrainians are being provided. What we've learned over the last year is that where there is a will, there is a way. I'll give you an example, and I don't think this is classified. I hope it's not. So last year in Poland, when the 777s were being handed off, there was a warrant officer two, chief warrant officer two, maintenance officer, and she mentioned to the Ukrainian that was leaving with an M777, she said, hey, if you have any problems with it, call me. Well, that has created this network of communications that is allowing the Ukrainians to sustain a number of their systems now. And it's really something. And I would encourage you, if you get a chance to go forward to Poland and see that in person, it's pretty inspiring. And it's not just in Poland. That's the other piece. It's all over different places because of their ability to connect. I think if you apply that level of ingenuity and that level of effort against the problem, I think what we'll see is that over time, we will find wrinkles. We're going to find areas where when you don't have a common set of equipment, it becomes more difficult. But I think we'll find where people overcome that with ingenuity and creativity, and then we are able to supplant that with some basic systems that may be more helpful in the long term.
Thank you, General. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know this is your first hearing in this forum. Congratulations, and look forward to working with you.
Thank you, Mr. Aguilar. I appreciate that. The next question is going to be with Mr. Stewart, then Mr. Cuellar, and we'll end with Mr. Garcia. We may have some time to do a second quick round. By the way, and maybe for the committee's sake, if we can find out. I know we've expended a lot of 155 rounds, and you mentioned the level of production. I'd like to know what if our allies, for instance, the South Koreans, have a significant inventory of 155 rounds. Are those compatible with our?
They are, sir.
Are they sending any of that over?
Sir, they're yes, sir.
On the short term, that would be helpful. And for instance, I know that the inventory on Stingers is pretty low, but the Brits have the Starstreak program. I don't know if they're buying those up or not. So just because I know that production line's still hot, so I just bring that up. If you could let me know, that'd be great.
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the briefers. Thank you both for being here. Thanks for many years' service to your country. I'm going to express a view here that I may be in the minority, but I feel compelled to do it for both of you as well as for others. And it's nothing radical, by the way. I'm not going to rock the world with this. But I want you to know I'm a defense hawk. I always have been. You see Air Force wings on my chest. These are my father's Air Force wings. He was a pilot in World War II. 5 of my brothers served in the military. I did as well, 14 years in the Air Force. And I don't know how many nieces and nephews now have served and are currently serving, and some of them are currently deployed. And I'm very proud of that. But there is a tone to this briefing and this, not really the briefing, but this situation we find ourselves that is distressing to me. And I think it's probably, or should be, distressing to all of us in some ways, including some of your comments, which I'll address, and some of my colleagues as well. I think we share this. I want you to know as well, I've always supported the appropriations for Ukraine. Mr. Garcia and I both sit on the Intelligence Committee. We saw this coming, and it was a remarkable work of intelligence that warned us of this. And it turned out the Ukrainians' willingness to fight changes things on the battlefield. And it was hard for us to measure this. But I need you to know, so that you can take this to the administration and to other war planners, there's a growing concern in Congress about where this ends and how it ends. And for example, Madam Secretary, when the President says, we will support them for as long as it takes, my question is, as long as it takes to do what? Or General, you have said that you want to go back to Ukrainians and tell them we will see this through. I would ask you, what does that mean, see this through? Because I'm afraid that our goals and Mr. Zelensky's goals may not be aligned. When he says we will expel every Russian from eastern Ukraine and from Crimea, that simply may not be possible. Not without broadening and expanding this war in a way that I think the American people would not support. And I think we've got to define this. What does it mean to see this through? What does it mean to say we will we will be here until the end. And the American people deserve an answer to that question. And for heaven's sakes, if we haven't learned anything in the last 20 years, surely we can look at this situation and say, can we apply some of the lessons there? Because for those who think we can predict and manage conflicts, whether it escalates quickly or slowly, we've surely shown that that's harder than we think. For example, Iraq and Afghanistan and Somalia and Libya and a number of others. And I would ask that question, what do you mean by, Madam Secretary, if you could answer for the President or the administration, what does he mean when he says, we will stay there for as long as it takes? To do what?
Well, thank you for sharing your thoughts. I think that's right. That's a responsible approach. It's a very responsible question. The President has stated that his goals for this horrible war, the conflict, is that Russia is a strategic failure for Russia, that we have a Ukraine that is secure within its internationally recognized borders, that the NATO alliance stands firm, and actually I'm listing it forth, but it's number one, is that the American homeland is safe and secure and not struck by Russia. Within that, you are right. There are multiple ways to define that, and I don't have a clearer answer for you than that, but I'll take that question back as you asked.
And I didn't expect that you would. It would have been impossible for you to, frankly, for a number of reasons. But I do think we have to define that. And if I could, in the concluding minute that we have, again, Madam Secretary, we talked with Mr. Case, for example, brought up, there is a disparity right now in the funding, which I think indicates a lack or a discrepancy in the sense of urgency about this. And for heaven's sakes, we think the numbers are something like 33 billion U.S. direct military aid, 19 billion to EU. Those numbers are fungible, as you know, and you can include a lot of other things. I think it's actually, the gap is actually much bigger than that, those numbers illustrate. But they should be entirely reversed. This is Europe's backyard. Europe should be the ones leading on this. And once again, we find ourselves having to lead, and when we should have, I think they should have. And so if you want a tool to try to persuade them, as I know you have tried to persuade them, as you indicated, tell them that there's caution in Congress for leading out on this in perpetuity without a sense that they're equally yoked with us on this. Maybe they're not ahead of us, but they should be equally yoked at least. And I think many of us wonder, well, how much more money are we going to give them while EU is lagging behind? And my time is gone. I wish we could continue, but again, thank you both, and I hope you understand my concerns that we have, while at the same time we're trying to support your efforts.
Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Cuellar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. I want to thank both of y'all. Every conflict, we should always get lessons learned. Let me go over a couple of them and see what you think, and you can add on to those. And want to talk about new concepts and new doctrines also from this war. I hope the U.S. military has learned several lessons from this fight, of this war with Russia. One is the importance of hybrid warfare. I think it has demonstrated, this conflict has demonstrated the effectiveness of hybrid warfare tactics combined with conventional military tactics, with unconventional tools like cyber attacks, propaganda, misinformation, or should I say disinformation campaigns. Number one. Number two, the need for better intelligence. I think this conflict highlighted the importance of having timely and accurate intelligence in responding to a crisis. Number three, and I think this has been brought up by the members, the value of training and equipment. Number four, the importance of partnerships. I feel also like with Stewart, sometimes I feel that Europe should be doing a little bit more since it's in their own backyard, but the importance of partnerships have shown has been good. I think this collective defense capabilities, especially getting NATO countries to do a little bit more. On the new concepts and doctrines, I'm referring more to the hybrid warfare. Could you elaborate a little bit more on the joint concept for integrated campaigning and the multi-domain operations concept?
Yes, sir. First of all, thanks for the question. The J7 will be proud of me when I get back and talk to him. He spends a lot of time talking about that on the joint staff. So over the last, I'd say probably 4 to 5 years in particular, sure, we in the military have concentrated on all domain warfare, as you mentioned. The view that, particularly if you look at how the fight is occurring now, that even just the incorporation of air, as an example, would not necessarily change the state of play on the ground. Once you get air defense that's capable of standoff to prevent the air, now you've negated that and you end up with this point-to-point. And so, as you mentioned, we're looking at cyber, we're looking at space. We're spending, as you all know as well as I do, an inordinate amount of time looking at ways that we increase our space capabilities. Those space capabilities, again, in a classified form, we certainly could talk a little bit more about that. But we're learning all sorts of lessons across those domains, as I was mentioning earlier, that I know will help us as we go forward. One comment I would make, and just to go back to Congressman Stewart's point, and certainly I'm not going to justify spending levels for any of our partners. I absolutely understand the burden sharing conversation. There are some things, and we had some in the House Armed Services Committee a session where we talked a bit about this. There are some things that aren't monetized that I think our partners probably don't get credit for. There are things, and there is skin in the game in places in which they are doing things that we just can't do based on a number of factors. And they probably aren't getting the credit for that, but I absolutely understand what you're saying, sir, and certainly back to you, Congressman.
Real quickly, when you look at warrant strategy, the end game, to follow up on what Mr. Stewart said, the end game is very important. Either you have a very defined military strategy, knowing what you want to do, or you just keep going till something happens. I hope one of the lessons, when we look at Vietnam, for example, conventional warfare compared to guerrilla warfare and different strategies, and I bring in the populations and all that. Any thought about the end game? And this might be above all of our pay scales. Any thought about the end game or lessons learned?
Sir, if any of my classmates at school hear that I'm about to talk about Clausewitz, they're gonna call foul.
Well, you can talk about Clausewitz. I'm actually studying that right now.
I think the big piece of this is what's the center of gravity for both sides here, and
What is the center of gravity for Russia? What's the center of gravity for the Ukrainians? I think that's the key.
Yes, sir. I mean, that's a really important point. I think, and I don't mean to go over here, sir. But I think the Russian population is a huge impact to what goes on in Russia. Now, that said, I'm not sure that Mr. Putin cares much about the Russian population. And his ability, back to all-domain warfare, to kind of work the information environment allows him greater flexibility with his population than we would certainly have with ours, based on how transparent we try to be with our inside our country. And I'm happy to talk offline as well, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Garcia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for the testimony and the data. Appreciate it. I just want to touch on a few things and maybe end with a couple quick questions. But I do think we've gotten the ROI out of the first year, right? After 1 year, the nation of Ukraine exists. Ukrainian leadership and government are intact. I think Putin has been knocked down a few rungs. Whether that's internationally or domestically, we can have that discussion elsewhere. I think we've compelled Xi Jinping to maybe delay aspirations for annexing Taiwan in a similar fashion as a result of what he's witnessed coming out of Europe now with this. And so while I think we were reactive in the beginning and maybe slow to act, especially on the sanctions side earlier on before the invasion, and we do have inefficiencies in this, and we're hopefully trying to realize that, we traded those things for speed in this first year to get arms and humanitarian aid to the Ukrainians who are fighting a defensive castle mission. I think that was a noble fight. My concern is moving forward, to echo Mr. Stewart's comments earlier, clarity over the next year is very valuable, not just for this body, but for the people that we represent, the American taxpayers. There is no Weinberger doctrine, right? There's a Weinberger doctrine for committing troops, but there's no Weinberger doctrine for exit criteria, entering criteria, for committing American taxpayer dollars in the form of weapons. And I always tell my constituents, those Stinger missiles were meant for those Hind helicopters. Those Javelins were meant for those T-72 Russian tanks. They were going to turn into pumpkins and expire on the shelf in the next year or so. And so we had an opportunity to match those weapons to their targets without putting an American in harm's way. That's a win for us. And because of all the things I outlined before, I was willing to tolerate that. But when I start hearing Ukrainians talk about F-16s and coming here and lobbying us directly for F-16s, and when I start hearing members of Congress and even in the administration talking about F-16s, there's no doubt that an F-16 would have ended the battle at Gettysburg on day one with a couple of well-placed, paveways. But it's not going to change the fight in Ukraine, right? Not with the integrated air defense systems and the S-400 systems that these guys are flying under. We know that's not going to happen. So my question is there a meaningful conversation where rather than just listening to what the Ukrainians are asking for, you're actually having a tactical and strategic dialogue with them and asking them what are they trying to achieve and then matching up a weapon system to it? I fear that we're being distracted by the silliness of asking for F-16s for things like this. In the meantime, we're not talking about counter-UAS capabilities, high-energy laser capabilities, and so that's question one. What is that too great of a defense that you were talking about, General? What is that system that actually is going to hopefully change the dynamic on the battlefield? Because what worries me is if our message is we're staying in this until we win or whenever Ukraine is successful, China is going to scale in support of Russia just as equally or more, and they can make it rain longer than we can tread water when it comes to support of Russia relative to our support of Ukraine. This is coming at a detriment of our ability to not only secure our own nation's security, but also support of Taiwan, Southeast Asia, and alike against the bigger bear in the form of China. That's another consideration. I think we have to do a better job of messaging on this long term, especially the next year, next 2 years. Is this a 5-year problem? Is this a 10-year problem? I'm sitting here in a probes. I sit on Intel, and I don't know if this is a 1-year problem, a 6-month problem, or a 10-year problem. And it's tough for the American people to get behind something like that without definitive sell-off criteria. I would also suggest that, Madam Secretary, in your discussions with them, I know they are struggling, but the symbolic nature of opening up a formal FMS case and actually procuring weapons rather than asking for free weapons, I think would go a long way with the American taxpayer. I know they're strained. I know they're trying to keep their arsenals intact, but that may be beneficial. So with that, I'll yield back, but I think the question is, are there meaningful dialogues that get us to the right systems that will actually change the dynamic on the battlefield rather than just a prolonged stagnant war on the ground, which is effectively World War II, Korea Wars type infantry, and go Navy, General.
Thank you, Congressman. Those are all great questions, and I will just say that, just touch on that and leave it to General Sims. You're exactly right that we have tried to focus, SAGU, EUCOM, Joint Staff have tried to focus Ukrainian discussions on what kinds of effects and what kinds of capabilities do they need, not what weapons platform. And that we have not, in fact, provided them with every weapons platform that has popped up.
Are they receptive to that when you have those conversations, or
yes,
they just look at you and push back?
It takes a little bit of relationship management, but yes, and I think that the credibility that the U.S. military has now goes a long way towards them accepting, sort of the advice and the perspective. But just so there is that track record. The detriment to our concerns about Asia, as I said, we're talking about global readiness levels.
Right.
So these decisions are made absolutely keeping in mind plans in Asia, not just plans in Europe.
They do detriment our ability on the global stage, though.
Not to below acceptable readiness concerns at this point, and that is a constraint, and sometimes that's a conversation we have to have with the Ukrainians as well. And just finally on FMS, the Ukrainians actually have done procurement themselves. They haven't done any big figure procurement from American companies. They don't have that scale of capability in their budget right now, but they have gone out and purchased some of their own capabilities. But it's a very good point that we need to also transition them to start their own defense spending planning, as well as everything else we will do to support them.
Sir, the SAGU we were talking about earlier was designed specifically to continue to kind of build these load-bearing relationships with our Ukrainian partners. at the onset of hostilities last year, there were a number of relationships that have been created already, but quite honestly, nothing in comparison to what we have now. I mean, as recently as yesterday morning, General Milley had an extensive conversation with General Zaluzhny, who he talks to at times, multiple times a week, and that engagement, Secretary Austin has the same with his counterpart, but it's replicated down the chain of command to the point where we have leaders who are dialoguing with Ukrainians in real time. So many of the reports that we get are coming from Ukrainian leaders who have come back for either for training or for other events, who we have now connected with, who are providing a bunch of information to us. We talk about train, advise, assist, accompany, enable, or kind of the advise and assist tenets. The only one of those that we are not doing right now is accompany. That's the only thing we aren't doing. But we're finding that our ability to do that kind of advising remotely is actually very, very possible. And then back to some of the skin in the game from others. There are other partners who are forward in country who we have a very close relationship with, and we're able to use those relationships to kind of increase our ability to advise with the Ukrainians.
Okay, thank you, Jim.
Appreciate it. Mr. Diaz-Balart.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having this really important committee. I think it's important that what Mr. Stewart said is understood. It's not just from him. And I also have always been supportive. I'm exceedingly supportive of making sure that Putin is defeated. But I think it's important that people understand that the American people need to understand what we're doing. Oversight is a huge priority, obviously, of this Congress. But it's not just defense funding, but a significant amount has been provided through the State and Foreign Operations Bill, which is the subcommittee that I chair. I asked Secretary Blinken on a phone call to brief the subcommittee on oversight efforts, but he was not able to make himself available, not even for a private meeting, by the way, with the members of the subcommittee, which I think, frankly, is just a real wasted opportunity for the cause, for the administration, and for the country. And so, because accountability and oversight is hugely important, and transparency for the American people as much as possible. And I think the administration, frankly, is just missing that, has just totally blown it in that effort. I got two questions. One is questions, quasi-comments. A lot of time was spent on our defense industrial base. The president's budget has not come out yet, but I'm hoping, because one of the things that Congress has done, it's been real bipartisan, is frankly, we've had to step up way above and beyond what the president has requested for our national defense, and I'm hoping those days are over. I'm hoping the president understands that this concept of just kind of totally grotesquely and grossly underfunding our defense and hoping that Congress will bail them out, those days have to be over. And we've seen the effects of underfunding to our industrial base. So again, it's not really a question, it's a comment. And again, I know that we may be beyond that because I'm sure that budget is already done. But I just think it's important for us to get serious about this very important issue. And this is a question, or potentially a comment and a question. It's hard for me, who is a defense hawk and I support the efforts of Ukraine, to go back to the American people and say, we want you to put your hard-earned money. And yet they see that we don't, frankly, take it as seriously as we should. Why do I mention that? Because the strongest allies of Russia, let me just give you an example. Recently, Venezuela was given unilateral concessions by this administration. And yet here's a regime that is pro-Russia, that recently has met with the Russians, and what is the attitude of the United States? Unilateral concessions. So how serious are we? Seriously. This week, folks, you're going to love this. The administration has invited the Cubans to tour our seaports. This is a state sponsor of terrorism, who, by the way, is advocating for Russia, and yet, obviously it's not that important because, we're going to have them tour our seaports. So if we're going to be serious about this, and it's going to be an all-in effort, it has to start from the top, and it has to start from the administration. And so I would just encourage you on the budget, again, it's probably late for that, to making sure that we take our defense and our partners' defense, and that includes obviously the Ukraine, but also Taiwan and others, seriously, and that may be too late for that. But on this other issue of in essence, on one hand, saying that this is a huge priority and asking the taxpayer to foot the bill, and on the other hand, playing footsies with all the allies of Russia, including in this hemisphere, with all due respect, folks, that doesn't pass the straight face test. And we're the ones who have to go to the American people, because I support helping Ukraine, and convince them that we're serious about this. So how can you, by the way, how can we justify that? In other words, explain to me how an ally of Russia, that's a state sponsor of terrorism, is now invited to tour our ports and the security in our ports. And yet we're supposed to tell the American people that we're serious? How do I do that? Seriously, how do I do that? And that's my question.
Thank you, Congressman. I will have to take the specific instances that you raised for the record, since I'm not dodging. I'm not responsible for those countries. I will say that you've put your finger on a very important point, which is part of Russia being a strategic failure and part of the process of Putin learning that this was a bad idea is exactly not finding workarounds. We have focused on Iran. That's the reason for the presentation we provided you with, and we are now focusing on making sure the world knows also there's a concern with China, possibly giving Russia a rescue option. But I absolutely agree with you that the more we can squeeze the Russian leadership and isolate it, the faster this will end.
And its allies, right? And its allies, and those who either help them or who supplant, whatever it may be. And there we're also, again, this is coming from somebody who wants to be supportive, but I will tell you, folks I represent look and they tell me, yeah, you're doing this, but at the same time we're basically giving concessions to Russia's allies. We're not that serious. And so, there's skepticism out there. And so we need your help to be able to speak to the American people in a way that's clear. And I will tell you, I think the administration has failed. So I would ask for your help in making sure that if we are serious about this, then let's be serious about it. Let's explain it to the American people, and let's show them that we are real, and that, that we're not going to just play games. And right now, I don't think that message has been relayed adequately by the administration. I yield back. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you, gentlemen. Just, by the way, for the record, 2 Iranian warships are visiting Brazil. And that's not a good thing to happen. With that, Ms. Capter, you recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. Apologize, I had to leave. They had 3 appropriation meetings concurrently scheduled. So, I wanted to thank Dr. Wallander and General Sims. Thank you so very much for being here today. I co-chair a 90-member bipartisan Ukraine caucus, and we've been hard fast at working toward victory for Ukraine, and also as a member of this very distinguished subcommittee. I have 2 questions, one dealing with some assessments that you might have, and number 2, hardware. Over the last year, what assessments can you share on Russia's changing capabilities and vulnerabilities? And then secondly, in terms of hardware, could you share with us how F-16s could or should aid Ukraine's cause, and how do you make decisions on where pilots are trained on F-16s? And then on M1A1 or M1A2 tanks, which are made in Lima, Ohio. And by the way, we fought a battle in this committee years ago. I think Ken and maybe Betty was here at the time. There would never be another land war. We'd never need any tanks. And we had to win a vote. And now we have them. And they're even better than they used to be. So I'll never forget that bizarre moment in American history. But anyway, do you have any timeline accurate on M1A2 or M1A1, old M1A1s, on their delivery time?
Thank you, Congresswoman Kaptur, and I have had the pleasure and the honor on several occasions of briefing the Ukraine caucus, and it's just wonderful to see you again. Thank you for all you've done all these years in keeping the focus on Ukraine. On Russia's capabilities and vulnerabilities, I won't go into the military space. I'll make just a political, economic, and diplomatic point, which is that Russia's economy is in trouble. The Russian people, unfortunately, seem to be able to endure a whole lot of pain without rising up and pushing back against their leadership. So we shouldn't be naive to think that the Russian leadership will change anytime soon, but they're playing a losing game. Russia's future was being integrated, competitive, more European, and the Putin leadership has taken them in the other direction. And so this is about investing in Ukraine for the long run. Not necessarily militarily, although I've made clear I think that's part of it, but investing in Ukraine's future as a European country, both politically and economically, as well as militarily. So Russia's main vulnerabilities are its own leadership and the failure of its leadership to make good decisions and, sort of dealing with the consequences of its actions. And I'll just say on M1A1, on Abrams tanks, we don't have a timeline for you other than what has been floated. I know that, as I suggested, maybe you weren't here at the time, Madam Congresswoman, but the Department of Army is seeing how we can compress that timeline. But it is, it is a substantial capability, and substantial capabilities take a substantial amount of time to build. So I don't have an update for you on those. But I'll turn over all the capabilities questions to General Sims.
Ma'am, I would note that a bunch of the capability assessment piece is something that we could probably talk about in a classified setting. It would be better to do that. I would highlight what Secretary Wallander said, however. And this is, you're seeing this in all the reporting, open and otherwise, but the Russians are willing to send, people essentially into a wood chipper. They're willing to as opposed to using, equipment or various techniques, they're willing to use human waves in order to absorb ammunition that's employed by the Ukrainians and then follow those individuals up with other troops. And if you look at Bakhmut as an example, Bakhmut has been exactly that, where the Russians, in particular Wagner Group for a while, employing conscripted prisoners or contracted prisoners, have essentially pushed people forward. And as they absorb the impacts of the Ukrainian defenses, they move people behind that to seize the ground that they have essentially occupied by dying. You wonder how long any country could sustain that. And now Russia is big, but in the last one, when they did the last mobilization, as you saw reported in the news, I want to say it was 1 million Russian men who tried to leave the country or left the country. If Russians keep coming back in coffins, you wonder how long a country is able to sustain that. So.
Thank you. I heard an interesting number. Do I have any? Is my time gone? The number, I was given a number the other day. The cost of Russia's set of acts on the world's economy totals about $2.8 trillion. All of the different things that have happened, whether it's rising energy prices and businesses collapsing or whatever, the total amount of money that the Allies and Ukraine have put in there is somewhere above $180 billion. So the cost to the global economy because of Russia's acts, you'd think some group at the UN would recognize that and make it more vocal. Just think of what this has caused around the world. And all the dislocation, all of the families, all the things that have happened, and the downdraft on economies anywhere, the disruptions in the oil markets. And so it's a very big loss to the world versus what we've been able to put in, to Ukraine itself, just to try to help her have a fair fight, winning fight.
Thank the gentlelady.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Maybe real quickly, maybe we can ask a couple more questions. I have more of a comment. I think that the comments that Mr. Stewart's made and Mr. Garcia and others, Mario, are consistent, that we're concerned that our support for Ukraine must be a shared responsibility. In that sense, our allies, our partners. And I'm not just picking on Germany. Germany is a substantial economy, the largest economy in Europe, and I think it's perceived, and I think rightfully so, that they have not stepped up to what they should do, especially because if any country should understand what threat is to Europe, especially to Eastern Europe, it's Germany, especially since half of it was part of the Soviet Union at one time. So any encouragement that you can give to Germany and, of course, the rest of Europe to defend Ukraine's security and give them lethal assistance. I know a lot of countries are stepping up to give humanitarian assistance, but it's the lethal assistance they need immediately to, especially with this so-called spring offensive coming up. That's important for us to do. One thing, too, that as a point to be made, when the comment is made that it's going to take 1.5 years to deliver Abrams tanks, that sends a message to the American public, well, how long is this going to last? Because 1.5 years from now is a substantial amount of time. And I found out in this town, when people tell you it's 1.5 years, it's usually longer. So and I still haven't got a really good response about why we can't take the Marine Corps tanks that are being obviously no longer deployed, recondition those tanks. I know there's some things you got to do to them, but and send those to the fight much sooner. Maybe you can get back to me and explain that to me and to the rest of the committee why that can't happen, because it seems to me that if there's going to be a fight on this, they're going to need them sooner, not than later. With that, Ms. McCollum.
Thank you. I have a comment and then maybe just a brief question. My comment is to my colleague from Florida. I'll talk to you later and learn more about what's going on. I said my colleague was to you, my comment was to you, my dear friend from Florida. My understanding, part of the Biden administration's engagement is because of the unprecedented, as you well know, humanitarian situation on the island, which is, I've been there, people are very challenged there. But right now, to date, this number could even be larger. 78,000 Cubans have been apprehended at the U.S. border with Mexico. So one of the things that the administration's looking at doing is getting a dialogue going and allowing Cuban Americans to assist, maybe visit back people in Cuba, and then work to do a reinstatement of Cuban family reunification program. So I'm not going to engage in a debate on this right now, on my time, but there are some other things. I think you raise a question. I'd like to talk to you about it, but there are some other things that I think that would be beneficial for many people in Cuba, and family reunification, something. I'm sorry, I'm not going to do that, because you talk fast. So, and I do want to just take a second to ask. So the United States has said that we're going to, that's happened is, Putin has also said his intent is to protect the people in our historical lands, and all the things that he's saying about threats coming from neo-Nazi regimes, kind of doubling down on all of this. And you pointed out that, and we'll do this in a classified session maybe with the Intel Committee or with our committee, lessons learned. Lessons that we're learning from some of the equipment that's been captured. But I'm very concerned about what this spring could be like. We've seen bits and parts of it, in some of the other battles that the Ukrainians have endured. And so, trench warfare, could be right around the corner again this spring. What kinds of things are we doing to also assist humanitarianly the troops? And I know that, quite often in war, I read a lot of history books. Doctors just treat soldiers that have been injured. But what are some of the things? We had some people who visited our office.
I don't have an answer for you, but I will follow back up and come back to you with exactly that.
That's perfect.
We have a list of countries that have provided medical vehicles, medical training, military medical, so we will get that to you. Yes.
Maybe we could do a quick lightning round because I got another meeting in a few minutes. So, Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me quickly and briefly touch on the morale, esprit, whatever, of the Russian soldiers on the field. I mean, they're suffering horrendous losses. I read, 106,000 casualties, supposedly. Have you seen any evidence of a deterioration of their attitude?
Short answer is yes, sir. And if you go back as far as last spring and summer, that was a significant impact to their fight in Kharkiv and then down in Kherson. And in fact, the morale in Kherson was allegedly atrocious. If there was a Russian document that was floating around that talked about things they were trying to teach their troops. This to give you an example, I think, of the way that they think about leadership. So in a portion where they were talking about how you provide leadership to your soldiers, you essentially one of the comments was, if your soldiers aren't doing what you tell them to do, the way you want it to be done, then take away their weapon and give them a shovel. And let them fight with a shovel until they determine that they're ready to do what they're supposed to do. I think that's indicative of much of the leadership that we've heard at the junior level. I put myself in that position as a platoon leader or company commander, trying to lead men and think about that. I don't know how an army survives like that. And then you go back to the waves of individuals. How long does an army sustain itself when what you're being told to do is essentially walk forward until you're killed or you make it to that ridge? I don't know how long you do that, sir.
Well, these are the Ukrainians and the Russians, have the long history together. They're related. They're kinfolk. That's got to be a real problem that the Russian leadership has in keeping these Russian soldiers motivated. Have we seen any defections of Russian troops?
We did, sir. I hesitate to give you numbers for fear that I'll get that wrong. The short answer is yes. There are a number of reports of individuals who are attempting to desert, who were shot by the Russian leaders who've been given permission to shoot their own soldiers when their soldiers choose to try to leave the battle or not advance when they're told to advance. So there are a number of reports of that. Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. It's kind of shades of Stalingrad.
Yes, sir. Yeah, absolutely.
Familiar situation. Mr. Case.
Thank you.
Real quick, because we got just a few minutes.
Okay, lightning comment. Budgeting, funding, not just necessarily for you, but for those of your folks that are listening. Please be totally honest with everybody about what this is all going to cost. People need to know what this will cost, and people need to consider how to fund it. We're under incredible pressure, as you know, not only in the defense bill, but across government. We have colleagues that are good representatives of their constituents who want to increase, who want to decrease, who want to borrow more, who want to borrow less. And we just need to know what it's going to take realistically to get through an assumption. And I'm making an assumption that for these purposes, that this war is going to continue, right? You got to make that assumption. I mean, we've borrowed a lot of money in the last 3 or 4 years. We American people need to know this is what it's going to cost, and this is how we're going to pay or borrow it, so we can all make those judgments. So no answer needed, just please do that.
Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank both our witnesses for your stamina and your patience. 2 quick questions, and let me sort of reverse the question Chairman Rogers asked. And we've talked toughness and endurance capacity from Russians, but I mean, the people that are really enduring here are the Ukrainians. I mean, it's exponentially different in terms of what's happened inside their country, what's happened to them, what they've gone through, as opposed to what the Russians. So, first question would be, given that level of sacrifice, how comfortable are you that they can sustain this kind of effort as long as they got the material support, the training, the types of things we are doing now? I'm not trying to put a limit on it or find a timeline, I'm more interested in your assessment of their capacity, which has been extraordinary. It's a lot greater than anything any of us anticipated, and I think anything any of us have seen in a very, very, very long time. So that's question number one. Question number two, this might go more to you, General Sims. We've talked a lot about lessons learned. If you had to give me 3 or 4, looking at things that we look at the world differently now as a military, because these are the things we've seen, what would be your top 3 or 4 observations as, okay, now we thought this, but now we're thinking.
Never had a terrible view of Russians. I've been going to, the first time I went to Ukraine was over 30 years ago. But they did have a separate identity. They had periods of their history in which they were an independent entity of one form or another in Europe. So what has happened since 2014 is they have further developed that separate identity. And what the Russians have managed, what the Kremlin has done since a year ago with the horrors in Bucha, in Mariupol, in other places, the horrific degradation and disregard for human life, is Ukrainians understand they can't live in Ukraine if Russia occupies Ukraine. And so that is I think that won't change for this generation or generations to come. So they can endure it too. But what we need to do, in my view, militarily, is we'll have to use the time that there will be not just military assistance, but financing, reconstruction, investment. They do have a perspective. The EU has said they will be a member of the EU. So that can help to build their economy. That can be part of what Europe brings to the table to give Ukrainians hope in the country that is peaceful and secure.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sir, that's a great question. Just hastily, I would tell you, I think top 3 things. Number 1, our stuff is really good. I mean, our stuff is really, really good. If you doubt that, you look at the impact of the 777, you look at the impact of the HIMARS. I have no doubt the Patriot will prove the same, as will our Bradleys and our M1s. Our stuff is good. Our stuff is good when it's employed the way it was meant to be employed. And I think, the training that we're engaging in right now with the Ukrainians will set them up for success with that kit. Number 2, when you have hope and when you're able to sustain your will and your morale, it's very difficult to lose. Very difficult to lose. In fact, I'd argue the only way to lose is to be completely dominated. And then number 3, and this is the case not just for this fight, but I think every fight that we've been around or seen or participated in, leadership is the key. And that's leadership at every echelon, at the national level, down all the way through the operational and the individual level. Good leaders provide that will and that hope and create that level of morale that allows you to win.
Thank you very much. Yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. We're out of time. I apologize. I got to be in a meeting upstairs, but I wanted to point out, though, the relationship between Ukraine and Russia obviously had a low point when Mr. Stalin was around, and the Ukrainians have a memory of 20 million dead Ukrainians during that period. So as we look forward to hopefully an end to this conflict by giving the Ukrainians what they need, and hopefully that we'll see our allies and others assist us, and we can see an end to this conflict sooner rather than later. With that, we adjourn.